Hey everybody, good morning, good morning, good morning. Welcome to another Saturday morning of Cafe BTW, a morning gaming podcast. I'm your host, Andy. This is the retrospective podcast where we have guests sometimes and we don't. Today is going to be a little bit chiller. It's just me. We don't have a guest down there on the guest screen. But really excited because this is a very busy weekend coming up for me. Including tomorrow, which I'll get into in a second. But I just want to say good morning. You know, I hope you have a coffee with you. I have a huge iced coffee here. Gonna cheers everyone right now while I sip this. Again, it's hey Jan, so good to see you, Jan. A lot of the OGers that are always here, like a yawn, like a no fear. You know, really thank you guys and gals so much for always being supportive. Today's going to be a little chill, and we're going to talk about Atari. Atari, kind of like, by no means am I a historian, but we are going to walk through kind of like a small look at the history of Atari, how Atari started, where they've gone. You know, I feel like there are probably in the late 70s, early 80s, one of the most important name in gaming at the time. And, you know, a lot of people remember Atari if you are as old as I am or have heard the name. Obviously, I'm not sure how millennials and, you know, this new generation feels about Atari. They probably don't have a connection except for just recognizing the logo. That being said, you know, we're going to do a deep dive, I guess, as deep as we can go with Atari today. And really a system, the Atari 2600, which is a part of that. But there's a lot more than just the system. You know, Atari also was a huge arcade. They produced and delivered so many of the classic arcade games we know and love from even into the 90s. So let's not forget that Atari was multi-versatile in video games, not only at the home console, but doing a lot of great work in the arcades, especially in the early days of kind of creating the arcade in a sense. But we'll get into that. I did want to bring up a couple of things that are coming up here. So tomorrow I'm going to be attending the SoCal Gaming Retro. The SoCal Gaming Retro is this huge Southern California gathering down in the Ontario, California Convention Center, which is about an hour or so outside of where I live in LA. And they're going to be a huge event. There's going to be a ton of people there. A good example is like the Completely Unnecessary podcast. Ian and Pat will be there. 8-Bit Eric. You got Tyler Esposito, who is My Retro Life. A bunch of other people like The Completionist, who's actually a G4 host now, will be down there. So as you can see, a lot, and also Retro Rick, who's a pretty cool YouTuber. If this thing wants to pop up, there it is. And it's just a gathering not only of people that are selling, you know, retro games, but there's going to be panels and, you know, it's going to be pretty cool. So I'm super excited not only to dip into my pockets and find some pickups and stuff that I want to, you know, buy and waste money, my hard-earned money on. It's going to be really cool. And there's nothing more exciting than seeing community come together in retro gaming, especially in Southern California. So today, tomorrow, it's happening. I will be at tomorrow's show. Looking very much forward to it. I think this is the first one since 2019, if I'm not mistaken. So really, really excited to get down there. And I'm going to be doing some live streams down there. We're going to have some live streams on TikTok. I might be doing a Twitch stream. I'm not sure. But for the most part, I'm going to be shooting a lot of content. Not that you need more retro content, but you never have enough. So keep in mind on that, and keep your eyes peeled. Now, something that happened a couple days ago, before we move into the show, is I was invited to create a community on Twitter. Communities is a new feature that Twitter has. So I created the retro gaming community, and in 2 days, we've already gathered about 258 members in the community. And no, more is better. More is better. Yes, more is coming. So I created the retro gaming community, which is kind of like a closed group community, but open to anyone, where you could, share retro gaming content. It's a closed loop. Obviously, you could see all these awesome people sharing not only their collections, but their collecting rooms and cool things that have happened. And already in just like 2 days, we've had so many amazing people join the retro gaming Twitter community. So if you are interested, you can head to my Twitter, and at the very top, I pinned the invitation to join. So you can go right to my Twitter profile, and at the top, you just click there, and you can enter our gaming community. Please help us build a positive community, a safe place for retro gaming content creators and just retro gaming fans to be. It's really cool that so many people have already joined, and it means the world to me. So thank you so much already for being a part of that community. We'll keep striving to be positive, do amazing things in the gaming community through retro gaming, which, as you know, is something I care much about. As No Fear says, more is better. So yeah, a couple of really exciting things. And today also exciting, a buddy of mine, shout out to Yo Epic. He is going to be selling me a complete in-box Perfect Dark 64, which I'm super excited to buy. He's giving me a great price for it, and I'm picking that up after the show. So it's going to be a busy weekend of pickups and content creation and just a good old time. Now, getting into the topic of today, there's a very important person that's a part of the Atari timeline. Now that we're getting into the Atari story, Nolan Bushnell, which is this wonderful man right here, is one of the most important people in video game history. He's very much up there. If there was a Mount Everest. What do you call the mountain with all the presidents on it? Oh my God. Mount Rushmore. Sorry. If there was a Mount Rushmore for video game creators and people that were important to the space, Nolan Bushnell is that person. He is the father of pretty much the arcade machine. He's the father of really thinking about bringing video games to the home consumer market. He is the father of Chuck E. Cheese. Believe it or not, after Atari, he went on to create Chuck E. Cheese. And a bunch of other things, and he's still around today. He actually co-owns kind of like a micro amusement park kind of arcade place in LA called 2-Bit Circus with his son Brent Bushnell. So the Bushnells are very much still around. He might not own Atari anymore, but the story starts with him. And like I said, this is going to be a retrospective of Atari from my eyes. I am no way, shape, or form a historian. I will do my best to give us a little bit of a brief on how did Atari start, what does Atari mean to the video game industry. But like I said, it all starts with this man. So Nolan Bushnell, here's a little video of him just for background sake, just to see him in interview right now. So this wonderful man went to a college in Utah back in I think it was like the very early 70s. And he went to the University of Utah. And at the University of Utah was a machine called Space War. And Space War was a machine that was kind of like considered one of the first arcade video games. And a young Nolan Bushnell went into, I forget what class it was, but someone had the machine at the University of Utah. And he walks in and he says, "What is this machine?" And everything explodes in his brain. He realizes that whatever this is the start and the future of video games, because his eyes opened when he saw this and says that we should make a version of this that you could actually play and pay for as a coin-operated machine. And what Nolan Bushnell ended up doing was he found a partner, and they created the game, which is very identical and similar to Space War. It's called Computer Space. But in this sense, they took it out of some like mechanical machine and scientific like machine, because it almost looks like a radar. And they made it into an arcade cabinet, technically. One of the first kind of real designs that was like, hey, this is a machine that you put quarters in. This is a machine that you play. And if you see here, it's a very funny looking futuristic machine. And really what this machine is just super important to the landscape of video games, because what Nolan Bushnell did is he went to the University of Utah and he saw that game and he says, we got to make our own game and we got to make this into a business. And that's what he did. He saw something, light bulb went off, and he created this game, which is Computer Space. Sorry, I said Space Wars. Space Wars is the game he saw. This is Computer Space, which is the game he created, which is kind of like a clone of it. But what they wanted to do was take it away from a weird mechanical radar type monitor and put a real TV screen with it, and Computer Space was formed. But then soon after, he realized this game wasn't very easy to play. It was kind of difficult and kind of silly with the buttons and how you would press the buttons below here. Like that's how you would control your spaceship. It really wasn't, so easy to play. So that's when they discovered and thought about the idea of teaming up with a man that would be very important to Pong. Let me find him here. I know I pulled him up, or maybe I didn't. Here he is. And let's see. Wait. Let's go back. I got this a little bit too far ahead of myself. So before Pong becomes the next big thing and really pulls away what we know as arcades and like playing arcade games, they had to figure out what's the name of Atari. And you're probably wondering, how does the name Atari come up? So when they were thinking about creating a company, there's a famous Japanese board game called Go. And as you see here, this is what Go is. This is Go. Kind of looks like a checkered board, but it's actually, just a famous Japanese game. I never played it, to be honest with you. So there's a word in the game Go called Atari, and what it means is the term is a situation where a stone or group of stones has only one liberty and may be captured on the next move if unable to obtain additional libraries. So they took the terminology from this game and used the term Atari to form Atari, which, is a really great name. I mean, you can't, it's even though Atari has been kind of outside of the scale of how the business has been, it is a recognizable logo and a name that we'll never forget. But it's a name that was created from an actual board game. So moving along the timeline, they're like, you know what? Computer Space was good, but it wasn't good. It wasn't easy to play. So that's where Pong came in. And Pong was a game that was a little bit easier to play, recognizable because it's basically table tennis on screen. And the birth of Pong, the first true arcade machine, was born. And this machine would launch what we know today as the main arcade universe, and where it all really started, where they said, let's put this in a bar. And they put it in a bar in Sunnyvale, California called Andy Capp's Tavern. And what's really interesting about this is they put the machine in to the bar, and literally 2 days later, they get a phone call saying that the game's not working. But it was kind of scary because they're like, oh no, what's wrong? But it wasn't that the game wasn't working. It was the game just had too many quarters in it and it wouldn't play anymore. So people were chugging through quarters and this game became successful. And that's where it all took off for Atari. After that, they manufactured tons of Pongs. They got into the arcade business and started manufacturing other games like this one called Atari's Gotcha, which was also an arcade machine. They also released games like Grand Track 10, which is also, yes, just like me, like Andy Caps, yep. They also released some other version video games called Atari's Grand Track, which you see here. Moving right along, they also brought in other games like this is Space Race, another arcade game. So what you're seeing is Pong launches the whole arcade universe, and Atari just begins to create all these other arcade machines, start making money, turning this into a real business. Atari Tank, which was another Atari arcade machine as well, and also a well-known Atari 2600 game. Moving right along, they do so successful in the arcade that Nolan Bushnell's like, we have to get this in the home. And that's when the whole idea of bringing Atari to the home is created, and yes, we are given one of the greatest video game consoles that ever was created, one of the greatest home consoles ever in existence, and that's none other than the wonderful, amazing Atari 2600, which in my eyes is still a favorite of mine. Let me find a good shot of it here, which is freaking awesome. Like, I can't even tell you how amazing it was to play this as a kid. The Atari 2600 is so important to the kind of landscape of the industry, and really thinking about, hey, these games are so popular in the arcade, how do we bring them home? So they did. But at the same time, the arcade market was still doing a lot of great things, was still working very strong, and the Atari 2600 was born. Now, what's interesting is, they needed a little bit more money, Atari. So Warner Communications in 1976, right before the 2600 came out, bought Atari for $28 to $32 million, using part of the money to buy Folder's Mansion. Nolan continued to actually eventually have disagreements with them, and this is where Nolan went his separate way. So this wonderful guy that kind of created Atari at a time when Atari was just taking off, kind of left because he had disagreements, and he sold Atari to Warner Communications. But with that said, they continued to make amazing arcade machines. Like, here's an example of another Atari game, Tempest, another example of a freaking classic arcade machine, which would none other than be Centipede, of course. Another Star Wars arcade licensed arcade machine was born as well. So that was really cool, and really, really awesome that they were continuing to really develop the arcade market, because it was so important back then. But there was also the creation of the Atari computer systems as well. Alongside the Atari 2600, they wanted to get into the personal computer side of things too. So Atari did try to make that, but what they realized is that the Atari 2600 was still becoming more of an affordable thing to purchase and also buy. Now, I wanted to show a video here because one thing that you don't know, or you might not know, is that Steve Jobs worked for Atari before he became the Steve Jobs we know today. So I think it's really important we watch this video and learn a little bit about the history of Steve Jobs working for Atari as we're in this timeline. So let's take a look.
You get notified of my latest video in the week. You might see that program.
Let's go through it.
Okay.
Here we go.
Atari when he was only 17. In the beginning of 1974, Jobs had dropped out of Reed College and returned to his parents' home in Los Altos. When he began looking for a job, he saw a help wanted ad stating, "Have fun and make money." He visited Atari for his job interview, and the secretary announced to the owner of Atari, "He's either a crackpot or he's got something." Jobs became the 40th employee at Atari. He was hired as a technician, earning $5 an hour. His first assignment was to help an engineer on the new game Video Basketball. Jobs would sneak his friend Steve Wozniak, who at the time was an engineer at Hewlett-Packard, into Atari's production facility at night, where he could play his favorite game, Atari's Grand Track, for free. In exchange for free game time, Woz, a whiz with computers, helped out whenever Jobs hit a stumbling block with some particularly tricky circuitry.
Yeah, he did.
The owner of Atari, Nolan Bushnell, took him under his wing. Jobs was working in order to earn enough money to travel to India. Woz came over to Atari to help Jobs build another Pong-based game for Bushnell called Breakout.
Believe it or not, the game Breakout was actually created by Steve Wozniak and Steve Jobs. This game was actually made by them, which is really, really interesting. Oh, you're okay, Acid. Welcome, welcome. We're just talking about Atari. And hey, David, welcome.
Bushnell liked the game, but the circuitry required too many expensive computer chips. He offered Jobs a bonus of $100 for every chip he was able to eliminate. Jobs made himself $5,000. When they weren't working their day jobs, Jobs and Woz were busy on their own in Jobs' family garage. They built a makeshift computer called the Apple I.
It's where it all started for Steve Jobs. What people don't realize, that whole part of that timeline, people forget that Steve Jobs worked. And here's the funny thing. Steve Jobs worked the graveyard shift at Atari because apparently he smelled, because he was so he was very much a hippie, and he smelled so bad that employees were complaining to Nolan Bushnell. So Nolan said he liked Jobs a lot, but he didn't want to fire him or anything, so he gave him the night shift. And that's where he created Breakout with Steve Wozniak. And then later, I see that OG Apple color scheme on the Breakout. Yeah, that's where it comes from. Isn't that crazy? There is another. Let me find the Jobs Atari. There's an interview with. Here it is. Let's hear him a little bit on this.
So, Nolan, you've recently written this fascinating book, Finding the Next Steve Jobs, and I want to talk about this. And I wonder if you could just start with, what was the first time that you met Steve Jobs? Tell
Here's
us
a story about
experience.
meeting Steve Jobs for the first time.
Yeah, Steve Jobs found Atari, and one of the things that I talk about is how you create a company that is really a advertisement that kind of tells everybody that you're a creative company and that you're cool and really interesting. And then the creatives will find you. And that's really what Steve Jobs did. And he was hired by Al Alcorn. And that afternoon, he came into my office as though that was the right thing to do.
First day.
First day.
When he literally, Walter Isaacson talks about this, he walks in off the street and says, I'm not leaving until I get a job.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And he just walked into your office just like that.
Well, that was after he'd been hired.
Yeah. And what happened when he came in?
I said, hi, what's up? He says, I think you've got a really awesome company. Awesome. He uses that a lot. And he said, I think that everything is pretty good, but I've seen your soldering connections, and they're really crappy. I said, well, let's fix them. And he says, I will. And that was kind of it.
Wow.
And then we got...
That was cool of you.
So really fun story and really important part of the history of Apple, because, look, the iPhone wouldn't have existed maybe if Nolan Bushnell hired Steve Jobs back in the day, because him working with Wozniak through the nights to make Breakout eventually created their think tank for saying, why don't we do this ourselves and create a personal computer? So really, really cool, really important kind of fun fact about Atari. And it kind of gives me goosebumps because I was a huge Steve Jobs fan growing up, and a really just fun little anecdote to the history of Atari, which is filled with just crazy history. Now that we're kind of moving on from the 2600, I did want to go through some of the top 25 Atari 2600 games of all time. So you have Defender 2, you got Berserk, great, Jungle Hunt, River Raid, Atlantis, Demon Attack, Joust, Spy Hunter, Raiders of the Lost Ark. Keep on going down this list. So many famous games. Asteroids for the 2600, Yar's Revenge, which was actually produced by Atari, and also the guy who eventually made E.T., which is we'll get to that. Centipede, of course, Miss Pac-Man, great game. Q*bert, Pong on the Atari 2600, Warlords, great game. Frogger, which we all know and love. Pole Position, amazing racing game. Dig Dug, and Dig Dug for the 2600 was actually pretty fun. Space Invaders, Combat, Adventure, which included the first Easter egg ever made, Super Breakout, which we talked about, Missile Command, great game. And my all-time favorite 2600 game, which I absolutely agree with this article, is Pitfall. So just an insane amount of amazing titles that we all know and love. Now, Nolan Bushnell's gone. Atari is owned and run by a different organization, and they're making shitty game after shitty game with small amount of time windows. Now, this is where it really starts. In 1983, we had the video game crash, but it all started because of one game, and that was E.T., because someone thought that it was smart to say, why don't we release a licensed Atari ET game at the same time as the movie. But the movie was coming out in 6 weeks. So they said to this guy, can you make an Atari 2600 game in 6 weeks, from not only pre-production to development to marketing to distribution to everything in 6 weeks, folks? Do you think that it was viable to make a game in 6 weeks? And people always wonder why this game was so bad. Because you can't make a video game, regardless of it being a 2600 game, which graphically doesn't come close to the games today, but 6 weeks to develop this game. And here's the funny thing, is that they made this game. They made this game, and Spielberg saw it before it got released and said, I love it. But why would you trust Spielberg to know what a good video game was in 1983? Or not 83, whatever year it was. Aston says, I never had an Atari, but my son got one of those plug-and-play consoles that you can get in the bargain store and play the crap out of. That's awesome. No Fear says, I got ET for Christmas. So disappointed. Yeah, because it was so ridiculously horrible. So what ended up happening is Atari, before the game even came out, produced 12 million copies of this game. 12 million copies. They developed them and put them in boxes and made them. Now, thankfully, well, not thankfully, but because the game was surrounded by a licensed movie, it sold 6 million copies. But people returned many. And then the problem here was they still had 6 million left. And then people were returning the game because it was terrible. So what did they end up doing? The rumor was in New Mexico, they put that there was Atari cartridges buried. So they literally buried these cartridges that no one used in a landfill in New Mexico. Years later, much later in 2014, we actually dug it up and proved that the games were there. And as you can see, they found all the games. But this caused a major problem because the market crashed. The whole freaking video game market crashed. The video game crash of 1983 was a large-scale recession in the video game industry that occurred from 1983 to 1985, primarily in the United States. The crash was attributed to several factors, including market situation and number of consoles and available games, many of which were poor quality, as well as wanting interest in console games in favor of personal computers. Home video revenue peaked at $3.2 billion in 1983, then fell around $100 million by 1985, a drop of almost 97%. That is ridiculous. Acid says ET stands for ecological error. Yeah, no kidding, Jan says. So we have this horrible crash, and then in comes Jack Tramiel. And Jack Tramiel is the father of the Commodore. And Jack Tramiel says, listen, I want to help Atari get out of this. So he says, I will own and run the Atari console home side while the Atari arcade side continues to push out. So I just want to be clear, even though the home video game market crashed, the arcade market was still viable. They were still making money there. And Jack Tramiel came in and says, I'm going to fix Atari. I'm going to do the Atari ST. So he creates this wonderful machine, which was actually pretty cool, but the home console was confused, and it wasn't until the Nintendo Entertainment System came out that we really got back to home console gaming, because the the NES really spoke to a market that didn't put their eyes on. Why do you think they called it the Nintendo Entertainment System? They called it the Nintendo Entertainment System because they didn't want to confuse the consumer market to thinking it was a video game console. They wanted people to know, oh, this is a actual, video game entertainment system. And that's where the NES kind of kicked in and helped get everything back. But at the time, Atari was doing personal computers, kind of getting confused and whatever they were doing. But at the same time, Atari was still producing amazing arcade machines like Paperboy, which was an amazing arcade machine. So even though they failed with a lot of things, they still made amazing arcade machines. And then we have Return of the Jedi, the arcade machine. Freaking great. This is a great game. And then Roadrunner, another example of an arcade machine. Just crazy. Just crazy that through all this, they still somehow were making good games. Let's see what we got here. Marble Madness, which I actually talked about recently on my TikTok. Another amazing arcade game that was coming out. They even went as far into the 80s and the early 80s making great games in the arcade. Here's Gauntlet, which is a fantastic Atari arcade machine. And then moving right along. Later on, Warner Communications then says and sells their part of their company to Namco, believe it or not, who was very much in the arcade business. So Namco enters the home console market in 1984 with conversations of its arcade games for the Nintendo family computer. Its American division majority acquired Atari games in 1985 before selling a portion of it back in 1987. So there's like a bunch of this, like, Atari's just getting passed around. The name, people are buying it, people are jumping in like Trammell did. It's just becoming such a mess. But like, look what they're doing in the arcade still. Like 720 Degrees is a freaking amazing game as well, and that came out in that was also Atari. Like, even though they were failing, they were still doing good. Now, another thing is, how did Atari kind of get themselves onto the NES? Is that they partnered with Tengen, who, as you know, made these famous black carts. The famous like black cartridges, and they were producing Atari games licensed through Tengen on the NES. But then the NES was getting pissed because they didn't have they were really angry that they were producing third-party games and licensing them outside of Nintendo onto the system. So there was a famous lawsuit between Atari Games Corporation versus Nintendo America. In the United States, of appeals for the federal court case in which the court held that Atari Games engaged in copyright infringement by copying Nintendo's Jock-Out system, which allowed them to play their Tengen cartridges on the NES. And I believe, in the end, the federal court declared that Nintendo was likely to prove that Atari was unauthorized to do this. So in the end, Atari wins the lawsuit. Tengen game goes under. Atari's kind of like foray into the NES is kind of spoiled. But that being said, it was still really interesting and really a clever way to get through that market. Again, later on in 1989, Warner Communication talks into their recently merged Time Warner to purchase Atari. So forming Time Warner in 1993, Time Warner reacquired a controlling interest in Atari games. It made a sub-version company of it, a Time Warner Interactive division. While the company initially maintained the Atari Games brand, the arcade games under the new ownership, the Tengen brand was dropped in favor of Time Warner Interactive, and that was the end of Tengen. But, you know, as Atari kept going on, you know, there were other things that popped up before this whole thing crashed, and that's obviously the Atari Lynx, which is a really, really awesome system, a really great handheld, where they were coming back into the fold, trying to do, you know, their best to make their way back into the consumer market. But the Lynx was actually pretty darn cool, and I don't know if people had the Lynx. And then, of course, we can't forget the ill-fated Jaguar, which was a system I had. And, hey, they tried to get back into the market with it, but it really failed miserably and went down, you know, a terrible rabbit hole of failure. But, you know, all that said, you got to give Atari credit because through all these years, they're still somehow around. Like this new Atari VCS, which is a system that you can buy now that you could hook up and apparently could download games and do like home computing on it. It's like a home computer / Atari 2600. I don't really know much about it, but this is kind of like where Atari is today. Obviously, Atari also still, you know, there all these licensed games with these famous games that they're trying to remake and stuff like that. Like there's so many games that the Atari name is attached to. But I don't really know much about this Atari VCS, but it's pretty fascinating that there's still something going on here. But I heard it's really expensive. Let's see. You can get this Atari VCS for $399. Hey, that's expensive, huh? So closing out today, we're going to go through what are the greatest Atari games ever made. The greatest Atari games ever made, not just the 2600 games. So we got Space Invaders, Kaboom, Combat, Demon Attack, Atlantis, Adventure, Asteroids, Missile Command, Yar's Revenge, Pitfall. Is that those are it? Those are the top 10, I guess. But let's see, the best Atari arcade games of all time. Best Atari arcade games. Yar's Revenge is so good. Let's look at the top Atari arcade games. You got Pong, obviously, Count Centipede, awesome. Breakout was great. Missile Command, a lot of the same ones we're talking about. Oh, I forgot Battlezone. Battlezone was really cool. Lunar Land. This is a good one. Lunar Lander was a great one. Tank is a very famous one. Tempest. Love Tempest. What's up, Retro Game Brews? I didn't realize that was you. What's up, man? Good to see you, dude. My man. So today on Twitter, I put up a question. I said, what's your favorite Atari game of all time? Obviously relating to the topic of today for the podcast. So we'll go through some people's mentions. So Project says, I'd say either Yar's Revenge, Tempest 2000, Crystal Castles, or Marble Madness. Retro Game Brews, who's in chat, says between Yar's Revenge and Keystone Capers. Connor says, I'll go for Centipede. We got Tempest here, Solaris, Kaboom, Combat, Pitfall, and Spider Fighter. Wow, nice. For me, I'd have to say Pitfall, without a doubt, is probably the greatest. You know, Pitfall is one of my favorite games. I remember playing this constantly, over and over again. And for the time, the graphics weren't bad. It was a pretty cool, like, side-scroller / like, up and down versing game, and it was good. But all that said, we come back and we got to remember that if it wasn't for this guy, there would be a lot of things we wouldn't have. And Nolan Bushnell is one of the most important people to remember in the history of gaming, and he's still alive and well. But one day when he is gone, I hope that we realize how important his role in the basically effort of creating video games, arcade games, and really thinking about how to consumerize video games for us with the 2600. There's no other important person than Nolan Bushnell that should be remembered and appreciated, because the NES, yeah, sure, the Nintendo Entertainment System was really the true consumer product that blew up video games, absolutely. But before that time, we had the 2600, and the 2600 is still one of my favorite Atari systems, or just general video games of all time. Adventure and Hero are good too. Adventure is a great game. Well, we're closing out here today, everyone. I just want to say a few reminders that I created the Retro Gaming Twitter group, and if you happen to be interested, you use Twitter, come join the group. We got a bunch of amazing people that joined, and I don't know, Twitter asked me if I wanted to create a community, so I thought creating a retro gaming community would be cool. And there's just so many awesome people that are introducing themselves, telling us about themselves, sharing what they do. It's really been so cool to see this already. Really, really cool. Yeah, I mentioned that he did Chuck E. Cheese too. So again, thank you so much, everyone. I don't think we're going to rate anyone today, but I just want to wish everyone a great weekend. And remember, I will be at the Retro Gaming Expo tomorrow, the SoCal Retro Gaming Expo. And also today, I'm picking up a complete in-box Perfect Dark Zero from my friend in a couple of hours here. But until then, really want to thank everyone that stopped by. Of course, we're here every Saturday. We have some guests coming up on the show. But more importantly, thanks to everyone in the VODs. We're now on YouTube, so I feel like more people are starting to see the show. But if you happen to catch the show live, I really appreciate it. Again, thank you so much. Remember, we only get a shot at this once, so really, truly be nice to people. Thanks, everyone. We'll see you next time.